Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to our first Legal Philosophy Between State and Transnational seminar of this term. I'm very pleased to be able to present our featured speaker for today. Professor Jennifer Llewellyn is joining us from the Dalhousie School of Law, the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University, where she is the Viscount Bennett Professor of Law. Professor Llewellyn is also the director of the Nova Scotia Restorative Justice Community University Research Alliance. I think that title is too long.
Yes,
you inherited. And she is also a research fellow at the Centre for Foreign Policy Studies. Her research interests are quite broad and far-ranging. These include restorative justice, international and comparative law, Aboriginal peoples, human rights, feminist theory, international criminal law, and public law. She's written several pieces in these areas, and especially pieces in restorative justice and relational theory. And probably worth noting amongst her many professional scholarly contributions is a recent collection co-edited with Daniel Philpott, which is forthcoming, or it might have already been. It's out. Out with Oxford University Press, called "Telling the Truths: Truth-Telling and Peacebuilding in Post-Conflict Societies." So Professor Llewellyn's talk today is called "A Restorative Approach to Peacebuilding." I'm very pleased to have her with us this afternoon.
Well, it's great to be here and to see some familiar faces, and I look forward to the chance. My instructions are that I'll give a presentation for about 35 to 40 minutes or so, and then leave us lots of time to talk, for you to ask me any questions that you have, but also hopefully an opportunity for us to engage in a broader ranging conversation about the issues and their connection to the themes of this seminar series. I'm very jealous that you have such a series and such an opportunity to come together, and so it's nice to be part of your community, at least on this one occasion and opportunity. I should say, just in passing, the title references another book from the Croc, which was part of a research initiative on ethnic conflict. The title of the more recent one from Oxford that this talk actually dovetails with, and so if you're interested in the themes and the ideas in it, that'd be a good sort of one space to go with Dan Philpott, is actually called Restorative Justice, Reconciliation, and Peacebuilding, and it's out from Oxford in 2014. So for any of you who've been following the news from Dalhousie lately, and I have some sense that it might have left the borders of Nova Scotia, you'll be very happy to know that I did not switch my plans and decide to give you a lecture on dentistry and restorative justice. Let me just say how absolutely relieved I am not to be talking about or focusing on dentistry for at least a few minutes. This and a brief bout of the stomach flu over the holidays has been about the only two respites from that topic in my life, and I'm assuming this will be more pleasant than the stomach flu. So it seems to have started out very nicely. Oh, my lunch sat well. But I think I am, on some sense, talking about a variation on a theme in terms of how a restorative approach to peace building is actually deeply rooted and connected to the relational theory of justice that underpins restorative work more broadly. So what I'm hoping to do is to be able to sort of skim the surface and at least provide you an introduction and also some examples to root that idea in, so that we can both have a conversation about the concepts and the ideas, but with some sense of their significance and impact in the context out of which these questions arise and back into which the ideas will return. And so I do use, as I did in the paper that some of you may have seen in preparation for the seminar today, the Peacebuilding Commission as an example, and I'll use it today as an example as well at the UN, but not because I think this is fundamentally or uniquely or specifically about the Peacebuilding Commission or UN operations, but rather that is a place where these conceptual questions have a home and have an impact. So when I was asked to speak last year to the World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates in Warsaw, Poland, on this work. And what was fascinating about that invitation, besides it being like strange, and I was certain it was a mistake, and also daunting on some level, is that suddenly I had to think about these issues that have occupied a great deal of my time from the perspective of concepts and theories and structures and processes, from the perspective of the people who identify themselves and take as their work in the world being peacemakers. So who actually kind of carry out this work. And so I read over the histories and the biographies of Nobel and its winners, and I started to see a really clear theme, which may not be shocking for a relational theorist, of relationship and human connection, which really has oriented both the work but also the selection of lots of Nobel laureates concerned with the work of peace. Martin Luther King, for example, in his Nobel lecture said, "In the final analysis, the rich must not ignore the poor, because both rich and poor are tied in a single garment of destiny. All life is interrelated, and all men," I'm just going to add women and assume that he'd be okay with that, "are interdependent. The agony of the poor diminishes the rich, and the salvation of the poor enlarges the rich. We are inevitably our brother and sister's keepers because of the interrelated structure of reality." Archbishop Desmond Tutu, on a similar theme, reminded in his Nobel lecture that we're not made for an exclusive self-sufficiency, but for interdependence, and we break the law of our being at our peril. In dehumanizing others, we are ourselves dehumanized. Perhaps oppression dehumanizes the oppressor as much, if not more, than the oppressed. They need each other to become truly free, to become human. We can be human only in fellowship, in community, in koinonia, and in peace. So this understanding of the significance of relationship and connection to these people, and there is this theme across sort of Nobel laureates in their expressions of what's significant about their work and what drives them, also seems to be reflected implicitly in the choices of the Nobel laureates themselves. Nobel generally tries to resist recognition of individuals for personal accomplishments or talents alone. Instead, it lifts up what laureates symbolize. So what they stand for, who they stand with, how they take this stand. Of course, it is the case that with all the simplifications that come with trying to render good symbols, sometimes the details they overlook stand for something quite different in the end. But that aside, if you look over the history of the laureates, I think it helps us see the importance of working relationally for peace building. This explains perhaps the recognition by Nobel of those who lead movements, the honoring of counterparts and collaborators, even controversial ones, the recognition of organizations that show the significance of collective commitment and action. And when Nobel was awarding the prize to Lech Walesa, an interesting symbol as time has progressed, over about 30 years ago, the chairman of the Nobel Committee pointed out in his ceremony that the prize itself should be a gesture of solidarity, recognizing the significance and importance of the movement, the solidarity movement in Poland. So, well, what's the message in all this, or at least the message that seemed to be affirmed from all this, which is peace building is not a craft for a solo artist. It is, we recognize, an inherently relational activity. I think it's this same insight that drove the UN to create the Peacebuilding Commission. The UN recognized that the fragmented approach to peacemaking it had previously embraced had not secured lasting or sustainable results for many countries. And the solution the UN sought was to create a new architecture, is what it refers to it as, or a new way of connecting the UN's work aimed at peacebuilding. The commission itself was charged with bringing peace-related efforts, programs, and actors together based on the instinct that these parts are related, and those relationships matter profoundly for the success of peacebuilding. So the focus of my work on this restorative peacebuilding project has been to inquire what difference it would make to our thinking and to our doing of peacebuilding if we took these insights about the importance of relationship seriously and placed them at the center. The development of this new peacebuilding architecture is instructive in this respect, and it's an example, but not certainly the only one or the primary one. In his report on Larger Freedom, the then Secretary General Kofi Annan prefaced his proposal for the creation of the UN Peacebuilding Commission with a reference to the alarming failure of peacemaking efforts. He identified, quote, a gaping hole in the UN institutional machinery, that no part of the UN system effectively addresses the challenge of helping countries with the transition from war to lasting peace. Well, it's this telling failure that he talks about that suggests that for peace to be sustainable, it cannot be made through security and or justice interventions, that it must instead be built through these sort of multi-pronged and integrated strategies. And this is the logic of the Peacebuilding Commission and the architecture that surrounds it, that coordination and integration of these activities will bring lasting results. So the mandate of the Commission is to assist, enable, empower post-conflict states to develop and bring to fruition their own vision for peace and the path to achieving it. And this approach clearly reflects a commitment to contextualize strategies that recognize and respond to the particularity of the society in question. But the means of the Commission achieving its work has been to bring together the actors and the agencies responsible for these activities and interventions and encourage them to share information with one another and to coordinate their efforts. And this is done largely through common meetings and common reports. But so far, the Commission's efforts have been limited and frustrating, probably at their best, and worse, at their worst, a failure. The experiences, I think, then are revealing. I don't actually think they call into question the insight that was at the core of the creation of the Commission, that peacebuilding requires an integrated and holistic approach, but rather the failures or the issues suggest that an approach needs more than logistical attention. This view is actually shared by the Review Committee for the Peacebuilding Commission that recently acknowledged the illusion of sequencing, which is the solution that many have referred to in transitional justice and post-conflict contexts as, how is it do we make these things all related? We just have to figure out the right order, the right sequence. The Review Committee said, there is acceptance in all quarters that sequencing does not work, that effective peacebuilding must not follow peacekeeping operations, but accompany them from their inception. Despite this acknowledgement, there's a widespread sense that the sequential approach remains the dominant one at the UN. Even if modest elements of peacebuilding are incorporated into mandates, the focus and the mindset of operations is a peacekeeping one. Peacebuilding tends to be viewed as an add-on during the lifetime of the peacekeeping operations, expected to come into its own in the aftermath. Such a sequential approach neither gives adequate weight to peacebuilding nor responds to the needs or realities on the ground. It's a fairly revealing finding. And it doesn't call into question the insight animating the creation of the Commission, that peacebuilding requires integrated and holistic approach, but I think suggests rather that mere logistic attention is failing these ambitions. Yet even in the recognition that more is needed, the co-facilitators of the review of the Commission seem fairly conflicted about the nature of the problem. So they recognize the existence of a single strategic document does not guarantee that all actors will act in accordance with its priorities. This seems good, wise, true. However, the problem as they see it isn't that actually there is a singular focus on practical coordination, but rather on the failure in supporting and enforcing this kind of coordination. So they go on to say the Commission should use its political weight to seek to align various actors behind the same overarching objectives. There's also, though, some hint in the review that more than political power and will may be needed to achieve the goals of the commissions. And this is really what I want to pick up on today. What they say is, we emphasize that the exercise will not succeed unless it is infused with a renewed commitment and a strengthened sense of engagement. Change must be psychological as well as institutional. Well, I'm not sure about whether or not it needs to be psychological, but it would seem that it requires more than a renewed commitment to practical solutions, to coordination, or to sequencing. It speaks, I think, to the need for new ways of thinking and understanding peace building and the relationships between the various elements of peace, justice, development, security, and other related elements. What's needed then, in my view, is a conceptual shift to actually be capable of underpinning peace building. Because in order to do things differently, which clearly the Commission seems to be oriented to doing and is clearly responding to a need in the world to do things differently, I think it is important that we dwell and spend some time creating a basis upon which we might be able to think differently and out of which we can act differently. So I suggest that restorative justice as a relational theory of justice, which I'll sketch in a minute, could provide a basis for this reframing or rethinking that needs to happen at the core to support peace building. In part, that's because of the restorative approach that's represented by restorative justice, and that I think some attention to restorative justice helps us access this restorative approach and to think about its implications. But also importantly, the relationship to restorative justice is key because of how central and broadly, I think, notions of justice influence and structure our ideas about peace and how to approach and achieve it. That they really are, they do go hand in hand, our notions about justice and peace. It is important, I think, to be clear that I'm not simply contending that this idea of justice is a suitable component part of peace building. So it's not just relevant, for example, to the aspect of peace building that's about justice issues, which we very commonly place under the label of transitional justice, or justice more generally. On a relational account, I think justice becomes clear as has a much broader ambition. It's a broader concept than just the narrow notion of justice currently at play or linked with peace building that's focused upon it as a mechanism or a means for responding to offenders or offenses and securing accountability. That's one aspect of the peace building work that we often reference as justice work, but that I'm asking us to think about the implications of a justice framework more broadly for peace building. So a relational conception of justice is linked more profoundly with peace building in that it rests at its core, in my account, and not only as having instrumental significance. Conceived of relationally, justice is concerned with then the nature of social relationships. In contrast to this more connected view of the ways in which there's a core and constitutive relationship between justice and peace, justice is often the subject of a fair amount of attention and debates that pit it against peace and or reconciliation, right? And so these will be familiar, likely to many of you, debates about how justice narrowly understood as the demand for a particular approach or manifestation of individual accountability, usually through criminal trials and punishment, but sometimes also pursued through civil and administrative penalties like tort, lustration, and reparation, particularly in international contexts. And on this account, peace and justice often come into conflict in contexts where justice is sought through adversarial processes. Such processes are perhaps tellingly steeped in war metaphors to describe the tactics and the strategies through which to secure victories for justice. The pursuit of victory, though unfortunately, and here's where the conflict often arises, can inflict further harm to the cause of peace by the very modeling of harmful relationships in the midst of legal battles. Justice then operates on this account as a particular act or operational requirement, so then the debate ensues, right? Whether justice should be sacrificed or scaled back or compromised to secure other values like peace, like reconciliation, even sometimes like security, or whether justice should be valued or pursued regardless of the cost or the consequences that may follow, since on this account the doing of justice may have independent moral significance or be an independent imperative. Or as some argue, justice must be done regardless of the immediate consequences, because it's essential to legitimate, meaningful, or lasting peace if it is ever to be a possibility, even if that contribution is not immediate or obvious. But I think this limited operational role or interest of justice at play in these debates isn't what I'm interested in or want to think about today. It's not the role I propose for restorative justice in relation to peace building. my efforts are not only to address the justice aspects of peace building, for example, to advocate for different process or institutional alternatives to the narrow task of individual accountability, as the familiar truth commissions versus trials might suggest. I think it's quite likely and possible, and we can think about this in the question period, that a restorative approach to peace building will surely have some institutional or operational implications on this front. But the account is not only or primarily concerned with this work. Rather, my attention to restorative justice and peace building is focused on the implications of this theory of justice, the theory that restorative justice represents, in terms of what implications it has for thinking about and doing the work of peace building. Okay, so what is this then account of justice that restorative justice offers? On my account, it's a relational theory of justice. So it helps us to see the questions of justice encompass not only how to respond to particular wrongful conduct, but to injustice more broadly, and about how to promote and sustain just relationships. So restorative justice starts from an understanding of the self as constituted in and through relationships with others and our surroundings. And by saying it's relational, it doesn't entail that it glorifies relationship of any kind, like connectedness, as a good in and of itself. But instead, it sees relationship as an unavoidable fact about how we live and who we are, how we're formed, reformed, informed. But this claim about the human self shouldn't be mistaken, on my account, for determinism or some thick version of communitarianism. Our choices and actions aren't wholly dictated by the sum of our relationships or relational influences. And on this relational account, individuals are significant and do have agency. That is to say that the view doesn't mean we have no choices. We choose, but on this account, it's clear that we can't make or realize our choices, and that we do not make and realize our choices for ourselves or by ourselves, and our choices have significant influences for others that warrant careful attention. So this perspective doesn't focus on the collective at the expense of or at the in contrast to the individual, but rather offers a different picture of the individual that places relationship at the core as fundamental and formative. To recognize this, then, that relationality is an unavoidable truth of who we are, means and demands that we pay careful and significant attention to relationships and their effect upon us. Relationships can be both positive and negative, and insofar, I think, as we're interested in securing conditions that support individual and collective flourishing, or in seeking and obtaining the good, in looking towards what it means to build or attain peace, we need to pay close attention to what quality and character of relationship is required for this. I think we know then from experience of our lives and in a range of factors, both personal and at institutional and social levels, what sorts of relationships, quality and structures of relationship are antithetical to human flourishing, which ones cause harm. And they are ones of oppression, unequal power, violence, neglect, abuse, discrimination. And it's from these experiences that we come to know the basic values that must be reflected in relationship, although we articulate them and dwell on them less, or we have less of a vocabulary to describe those relationships. I describe them in my work as aiming for an equality of relationship, and by this I mean relationships that are marked in their character and quality by equal respect, care, concern, and human dignity. And these describe or form the basis of the criteria for just relationships, which are the goals of justice understood relationally. The importance of these values, though, is familiar to us, right? As they are actually reflected as the very tenets in our protection of human rights, both internationally and domestically. If we take this relational approach to justice, then, as restorative justice does, injustice and wrong are understood in terms of the harm caused to individuals as relational beings, as they live in and through relationship with others. And the goal of justice is then to address these harms and to establish or reestablish equality of relationship. This relational account views equality then through a relational lens as well. right? And it's indebted to Christine Coggle's important work on the notion of relational equality. To claim that justice is at its core about relational equality is not to say simply that it's concerned with equality of treatment or outcome for individuals, although to be certain this would be a desirable result. Relational equality is a more fundamental commitment to the nature of the connection or of the relationships between and among parties, not just the outcome. So understanding equality this way makes clear restorative justice does not, it cannot be reduced to matters of justice, cannot reduce matters of justice and injustice simply to inequality or equality claims in the sense that we approach and understand them in our Western legal, largely liberal tradition. Restorative justice is not concerned then, for example, with equality that some retributive theories of justice seek, often through a particular set of historical practices we refer to as punishment. Retributive accounts seek equality through an evening of the score between wrongdoer and victims by inflicting harm against the wrongdoer in equal measure, typically, to that done to the victim. And by contrast, restorative justice problematizes the issue of what sets of practices can or should be employed toward the goal of restoring equality in the context of the relationships particularly involved. So it demands concrete consideration of the needs of each party to realize equality of relationship. A relational theory of justice then does not approach equality in individualistic terms, and so it can't be achieved by ensuring the same treatment or equal measure of benefits or burdens or even identical outcomes for individuals. Rather, equality can only be understood and achieved through attention to the relationships in and through which selves exist, and is fundamentally concerned with the nature of those relationships. On this understanding, the interests and the concerns of justice then align with those of peace. Justice is fundamentally concerned on this account with just relationship, which forms the basis for lasting and sustainable peace. Justice viewed relationally is not simply then a necessary precursor to peace, but is better viewed, I think, as a conscious peace-building activity, affecting and fostering just relationships in the wake of harm or in the face of injustice. If we seek lasting and sustainable peace, we can no longer afford to be blinded to the relational nature of human beings by justice processes that blinker our eyes with this singular focus on individual culpability, blame, and punishment as the focus of justice. We need, I think, a wider perspective to see the complex picture of individual responsibility in its relevant social context and causes if we're to hope for change towards peace-filled futures. There's interestingly some significant resonance, I think, with this relational theory of justice, the account I offer, and Amartya Sen's recent articulation of his theory of justice. So Sen's theory is not a relational one, in that he is actually fundamentally concerned with the individual as the unit of analysis and with comparing and contrasting individual interests with collective ones. However, it is, I think, similar in the sense that Sen identifies the focus of his theory as addressing and reducing injustices and enhancing justice in the world, as opposed to and in contrast to the tradition in contemporary justice theory that favors interest in what he refers to as perfect justice, through attention to justice institutions or social arrangements. Sen identifies a weakness of such an approach is the lack of attention paid to the outcomes and the implications of those institutional arrangements for the lived reality of people, which I would claim is a relational reality. These theories don't judge themselves or take as a measure of success their ability to address or reduce injustice in the world, as that analysis would be, according to Sen, comparative and imperfect by its nature, as it seeks or can only achieve something better in terms of less injustice or more justice, but not perfection. Relational theory explains and makes clear the similar necessity to think of justice in concrete terms of the situation as it exists in the world. Seeking justice relationally is necessarily a contextual exercise. It is about addressing the harms that have been done as between and among people and in relationship to one another. It's worth noting that this feature of restorative justice frustrates many who seek from a theory of justice instruction as to what exactly these justice processes, outcomes, and just social relationships look like. This desire is the search for that perfect justice, Sen references. That's not the focus of a relational theory of justice. And just because I think I am unable to fully remove myself from the events at my faculty, I'd say this is one of the things that's been operative in terms of the debate, particularly as it's played itself out on Facebook and Twitter around restorative justice in the last few weeks. And I dare say the depth of frustration of the media over trying to describe or get a handle on what this thing is. Not only does a relational theory then shift our focus, I think, from perfect justice to addressing injustice and from processes and institutions to contextual responses, it also requires us to think about justice in ways that our justice language actually makes more difficult. We speak commonly of seeing justice done or served up or achieved, but doing justice restoratively, like the relationships it seeks to achieve, must be and is by necessity dynamic and fluid. Thus, it might be more appropriate to adjust our discourse from talking about justice done to doing justice, which is not to suggest that relational justice theories are just purely procedural in nature. In its idea of equality of relationship, relational justice does have a substantive goal or an end state that it seeks. However, the shift in language is an acknowledgement that a relational theory of justice does not identify justice with one set of practices or perfect institutional arrangements, but rather requires input and participation of those involved to understand the nature of the harm to relationships in order to determine how to respond and to commit themselves to their role in the restoration of relationship. Restorative justice is in this way, though, able to take account of the significance and complexity of the interconnected webs of relationship in and through which we exist, and come to define and understand both ourselves and what justice requires. So a restorative approach is then grounded and contextual. It requires careful attention to processes. It requires processes that are inclusive and participatory. They must be as inclusive as possible of those individuals, groups, and communities affected, including but not limited to the categories we're most familiar with: victims, offenders, their communities of care and support, other relevant communities, and members of the wider communities affected or who could affect a just outcome. Through dialogical processes, parties are able to understand the harms resulting from the wrongs or the injustices they're faced with, recognize the significance of broader injustices, and arrive at a plan for addressing the harms with a view to realizing equality of relationship in future. Through this sort of broad inclusion, such processes are able to ensure the appropriate balance between both macro and micro justice issues, and to avoid sacrificing the needs and interests of individual parties. Such processes also have the potential to be democratic in the sense that they strive to ensure that those affected can participate in the process of decision-making about how to do justice in a particular situation. It is thus not sufficient for parties to simply be included, right? It's not just that they were in the room, but the decision, and so should feel included in the decision, but they must be given the opportunity for genuine participation in a meaningful way, which includes but is not limited to taking part in the process of dialogue about the very requirements of justice. Here too there is resonance, I think, with Sen's sense of the important relationship between justice and democracy. Implications of this theory of justice as a conceptual frame for peace building, I think, moves justice clearly from a narrow aspect or element or step in peace building, sometimes in tension with other elements, and offers a way of understanding the work of peace building as the work of building sustainable, just social relationships. And this restorative lens offers a different and interrelated view then, a basis, a foundation for the various elements that are sometimes brought under the umbrella of peace building, or in the context of the UN, into the same report or meeting room. Their common cause, be it security, justice, peace, development, is addressing injustice and enhancing and promoting just, understood in terms of the structure and quality, relationships. A relational lens can then be applied to security, peace, negotiation processes, or justice, narrowly meaning accountability processes, social and economic development, and other aspects of peace building. And through this lens, their respective and collective roles, I think, can be better understood and their approach reoriented in a way that could actually achieve that integrated or holistic approach that seems so needed. So as I've been noting, the work of justice, this narrowly construed idea now about accountability as an aspect of peace building, I just want to look to two examples, maybe justice and then development. So the implications of this lens for justice narrowly construed as accountability as an aspect of peace building will be significant. I think this lens means a move away from processes that focus solely on individual culpability and rely on adversarial processes to produce truth or determine truth, adjudicate truth, and provide remedy. So it would entail a move away from trials and the model of prosecute and punishment to restorative institutions like some, but certainly by no means all, Truth Commission-like processes that facilitate inclusive and participatory processes aimed at meaningful accountability through the expression of responsibility and participation in making reparation for harm. By way of another example, for development, a relational theory of justice would entail a similar significant shift from the traditional and possibly a still mainstream view of development as aimed at economic attainment through industrialization and often related westernization to one focused on relationships, on the equality of relationships essential to understanding the goods sought by development and how they ought to be attained in a particular context. This, as Sen suggests, would not be satisfied by finding perfectly just social institutions. Rather, a relational approach casts our gaze, as Sen does, to consider the nature of existing relationships and patterns of relationships and how they need to be adjusted in context to enable and promote human flourishing and to contribute to building lasting and sustainable peace. In this work, a relational approach does not ignore the importance, though, of social and political institutions. Rather, it doesn't focus solely on their reform, but takes cues for their shape from what is needed to address injustice and structure and promote relationships of equal respect, concern, and dignity. So does perhaps less of a top-down institutional reform effort than a more organic one that then needs to influence and change structures and institutions. On this relational conception of peace building, the relationship to development, between development and justice is clear, while some have actually taken a more limited view of peace building. And I think this is true of the UN in some sense, and maybe what's driving some of the difficulties. That the definition of peace building looks more like securing an end to violence or oppression, or the other UN's favorite definition is peace building as a focus on actions and efforts aimed at avoiding relapse into conflict. A restorative approach suggests that peace building is concerned with the social relationships that are required for lasting and sustainable peace. So that the focus is not on just actions and efforts, but actually at the core of at a conceptual level of the relationships required. And viewed from this perspective, building peace requires us to see the interconnectedness and common cause of security, peace negotiations, justice, and development. And further, it makes clear that they are related in a much more robust and integrated way than the familiar focus on sequencing or coordination as an account of their interaction or relationship would suggest. That they need to be linked more at a conceptual level, because it's only then with this renewed and changed understanding and common understanding that those who come to the table as security will know that they are also talking about the same thing and the same ends as those coming to the table about development or about justice, and be able to then have common conversations about the contributions and aspects of that work, but recognize that they are contributing to common work. I think this is exactly what's been lacking for the Peacebuilding Commission, which has sought new architecture but lacks any new framing to give support and shape to what it's trying to build. The Peacebuilding Commission seeks more integrative and holistic approaches, but tries to achieve this simply by coordinating the work that's done, by sort of like collecting all the tools in the same toolbox, so to speak, but with no different way of thinking about the nature of the work or how it might be integrated. So how to understand what the nature of the project is so that the tools could be used to common effect. A restorative approach to peacebuilding would, by contrast, require and support a change in the way in which the Peacebuilding Commission would govern itself and how it would understand and do its work. While a restorative approach can't dictate particular predetermined processes or practices, it does offer and is rooted in fundamental principles that guide practice that emerge from this relational theory. And these have been, I've been referencing these throughout my description. A restorative approach is relationship focused, it's holistic, it's integrative, it's inclusive and participatory, democratic, committed to subsidiarity. And these principles entail practices that are flexible and contextual, based on dialogue and encounter, non-adversarial, often multi-partied, and future-focused. So in closing, I just want to give you a sense of two, there are many, and I hope that this will just kind of prompt your questions in our discussion. Two differences I think a relational approach, this different way of thinking to peacebuilding might make. One is that the UN Peacebuilding Commission reflects, I think, actually a commitment, although one it finds difficult to make good on, to this principle of subsidiarity. This idea that we ought to make decisions as close to those who are affected and impacted by those decisions as possible, right? It's the account that drives, in its best versions, our federalism, our account of federalism. So they seem to be committed to this idea, right? You can see this in its articulation and commitments to work collaboratively with member states involved in cases particularly that come onto the peacebuilding agenda. They have a related commitment to complementarity as the principle underlying the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, whereby jurisdiction will only be exercised if a country is willing or unwilling or unable to prosecute. I think a relational framework reveals that these principles entail a commitment to contextuality, and they help make sense of what would be required to make good on these principles. It's important that we involve those with intimate knowledge of the context and the relationships at stake if we're to have the knowledge and capacities needed to address the harms and build a foundation for a new and better future. These principles, approached relationally, would profoundly alter and improve peacebuilding by making clearer the role that international actors should play in such efforts and the necessity of ensuring participatory and inclusive processes in which local and national actors lead the way. Peacebuilding cannot, on a relational approach, be done to nations or for nations or communities. It must rather be done with them. And I don't think this leaves international actors, be they the UN or NGOs or transnational church and faith organizations or aid agencies, with no role. In fact, within a relational framework, the status and the role of outsiders becomes clear. Indeed, the relational approach allows more complexity, I think, than do approaches based on these sort of binary or adversarial choices such as outsider or insider. A relational approach invites the participation of different parties in the work of peacebuilding according to their relationships and connections, their role in the causes and the solutions of conflict, and turns our attention in such a way that we are required to articulate those and to understand those so that we can give account of the proper role and relationship of international, transnational, and local actors and agencies in this work. So a relational approach would ask, how have these parties contributed to the wrongs, to the harms to relationships? How have they been affected by the wrongs? What contribution can they make to the restoration of affected relationships? And this relational approach envisions then a more constructive role for regional and international organizations rather than that which they normally play now as conveners, instructors, and enforcers. Another difference, and the last one I'll point to before turning it over for our conversation, another difference and implication of this approach, I think, is that it requires a more holistic and integrative thinking about peace building. So one way in which this is true, I've been describing, right? It requires us to overcome and reject this sort of siloed thinking about peace as distinct from the work of security, justice, development, negotiations. Such that, for example, by way of another example, it becomes clear that security is not simply connected to development, but that they share a common cause and goal. That security and development are both oriented and to this establishment of relationships of equality. And so the means and the methods of security interventions must be assessed and evaluated and selected in light of this goal, and not simply imagine that they can carry out the work on some other basis, efficiency or available resources, and imagine that the other work of picking up the pieces of destroyed or harmed relationships can be the work of other peace-building partners later in the sequence. So I think it does that in terms of having us think in the implications of thinking in more integrated and holistic ways. But I think it also challenges our approach to the work of peace-building in fragile, post-conflict, and transitional contexts as distinct from and disconnected from the work of building and sustaining peace in our so-called established and stable contexts. That understanding peace building relationally should draw our attention to the places and the efforts at taking a restorative approach to building and sustaining peace in established and stable states as being really relevant for our thinking about peace building in post-conflict, fragile, or transitional states. Indeed, attention to these efforts outside the context of transitions, outside the context of post-conflict contexts, is, I think, particularly significant because it makes clear that the work of peace building is not only a reactive process. It is not work with which we can engage in the wake of war and violence and transition and be done with. It demands attention on an ongoing basis in order to promote, protect, and sustain peace in the world. And I think this requires us to consider how the work of peace building is going to be carried on and carried through on the long haul, which means ensuring that peace built in the transition is mindful of the institutions, the structures, the processes, the conceptual frames that are used at that time that will be needed to sustain it. So there is some attention to restorative work already within the international kind of peace building community. But this community has paid little or no attention and made little or no connection to the restorative work underway for domestic issues in many contexts. They really do operate almost like two different worlds. You can see this most obviously in some of the development and peace building work that seeks to look at institutional or legal reform. Immediately, and not insignificantly influenced by Western donors, the instruction is to go find models that work. And those models that work are in established and stable states, and they are often imported and funded wholesale with no question of the orthodoxy that underlies them and no connection to the very deep debates that are happening within those stable and established contexts on what the norms and values and concepts should be, sets of assumptions should be, that are underlying those. So while there is significant energy, as we are now all acutely aware too, around questions of justice and justice systems, structures of educational systems, how economies work, that cast some light onto this idea, liberal individualist notions that underlie these institutions in stable contexts. Those debates are not imported. Those debates are not connected to the work of peace building and efforts in fragile and post-conflict contexts. And so while the questions come up in the context of peacemaking and transitional justice in ways that raise exactly the same sorts of questions for how is it that we must think and work to support and sustain peace in these transitional contexts, those questions are lost and not carried through to the level of institution building and structure building through which peace is sought to be maintained. So one of the implications, I think, of bringing a relational frame to this work of peace building is to connect and to begin to connect those conversations that are fundamentally commonly concerned with the sustaining and maintaining peace that are happening within stable and established democracies and contexts as they are happening and are necessary in post-conflict and transitional contexts. There is then much effort and energy we should pay to the restorative approaches developing within education, justice, human rights, social services, child and youth services, in many domestic contexts, including current efforts at contexts to become restorative cities or jurisdictions, or to consider, which I think really underlies this movement, what a restorative approach entails for governance. These experiences and the work of these local contexts would be instructive for international efforts to build and support lasting and sustainable peace. So these efforts include those within Nova Scotia, which has provided significant international leadership in taking a restorative approach. So perhaps actually in the end, it all does come back down to RJ and dentistry at Dow.
Thanks very much, Preston. So we've got plenty of time for questions, and Russell's already trying to jump the queue or get the head of it.
I should not be nice. As a convener, if there are other questions, please go ahead.
He also has a really intimidating sheet of arrows and circles.
This is
And
how my brain works. Now, this is hopefully not
That's
how
how
it's gonna
mine
come out
does.
because...
Okay, Will's got a question. Russell.
What are you talking about?
yes.
Yes. So you'll notice the microphones don't actually
If you could
project any
circulate them,
sound,
that'd be great.
but we're recording them, so.
This thing stuck to the base, I can't put it on.
it's past problem solving in action.
Is it on?
It doesn't project, it just goes to the camera, I
All
think.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. It's always delightful when a teacher meets a student years later and discovers that she's flourished, and you certainly have flourished. And thank you very much for the lovely talk. You probably don't want to talk about Dell, but you kept bringing it up, so I'm
I
going
did.
to just bring it. My question was prompted by your account of restorative justice today, but also by some comments I read in the newspaper that some of the women in that case didn't want to participate in the restorative justice process, and so they objected to it on those grounds. So my question is a really simple one. In giving your account, two of the elements that you mentioned as being essential to the restorative justice process was it had to be inclusive and participatory.
Yeah.
So can that process be engaged without the participation of the people who have been harmed by whatever has transpired?
Yeah. So I think the simplistic answer to that would be no, of course it couldn't work if no one who was harmed and impacted by it was willing to participate or take up the response to justice. In fact, nor could our formal justice systems work if we didn't fund on a regular basis a justice system because we see as a common social concern and responsibility the response to justice as as a harmed party. Part of the challenge of the way we set up that system is sometimes that's the only high-level harmed party who shows up in the room. And so, a restorative response to justice turns equally on ensuring that those who actually are affected and harmed participate. But I think then what that entails, and so the example of dentistry is a good one because it's in the news. So that's a very complex, layered case, right, where there are multiple harmed parties on multiple levels. So there are some directly harmed. Some of those directly harmed are represented in the four who have chosen to share their views in the public. They do not represent all of the directly harmed parties. In fact, they're a smaller group of them. There's another very large community of people who are affected, women directly named and affected in the Facebook posts, women who are members of that class, so we're directly more targeted by general comments, men who are not connected to this group who've also been significantly impacted, faculty members, female and male, who work in that institution. And then, of course, there are the very public harms that I think are driving the sort of visceral response in the press, which are clear around how disruptive this has been to the public trust, not only in terms of the potential of the 13 graduating and being in healthcare practice, but also what it means around trusting institutions to be able to assess and develop competencies such that we would feel safe. And so there's all of those layers of harm that I think need to be represented in a process to be able to go forward. The complex question then is one that I think confronts us around justice processes more broadly and not just restorative justice, which is what do we do when some don't want what is on offer as the justice systems, right? So actually the four have said they don't want to file a formal complaint for a set of obvious and good reasons, nor participate in the restorative process. And there is like sort of not some third door that's possible. You know, I'd say anecdotally part of the reason for the development of restorative justice generally, but also in the context of DAL and elsewhere, has been because of what we know to be the realities of the rigid kind of formal system, which is who it cannot include. And so it does dovetail back to how the singular application, we see this in peacebuilding context as well, the singular application of accountability mechanisms that leave out the voices of those impacted, but also are concerned with satisfying the needs for backward-looking individual accountability, but not for future-focused issues, and can't merge the connection of those that individual culpability with the systemic causes and contexts in a way that the outcome can address the breadth of justice needs is operative here as well, right? And so, you know, I think one of the challenges then is saying, well, part of this has been perpetuated by the myth that some restorative justice advocates also say, I think in not careful enough ways, around victim-centeredness. It's all about what the victim wants. So the victim will have a veto or determine, you know, for all the reasons it's been wrong for us to have an offender-centric system where it's all about what the system needs or about the offender's rights and not really the direct victims much at all, except maybe by proxy or surrogacy. It's been wrong to exclude that. It would be equally wrong to flip the tables on that and have a system that was only and entirely determined by victims. And I think a restorative response is more victim-centered than our current justice processes, or brings the victim into the center because it attends to needs and harms as the relevant factors rather than the breach of the law. But that doesn't mean that it's driven just by whatever the victims want. And so I think there is an aspect here of trying to balance the need to have a just response, a robust just response, that isn't just about a conflict in what the primary or direct people impacted would like to see as a process, but to ensure that there's a robust set of processes that they could be included. It does depend, though, on them participating inclusively. So, I mean, the answer has to be, if they don't want to participate, they will never be forced to do so, which is also unlike the way we co-opt people and into formal justice processes, which is why the one thing we have very clear evidence on is the re-victimization of those who've been victims within formalized justice processes that use them as an information source or as part of the process, but don't make them central. And so I think it's a very difficult question, and one that we should be troubled by, about how can we ensure just responses, but do that balancing all of those needs, rather than just do the more simplistic, I'm going to take one side or the other. It's going to be all about the offender or what the system needs, or all about what the victim needs. These are really difficult balances, and I think you're seeing that play out.
Thank you.
Can I have a microphone? Thank you. We share everything here. We're relational.
Good, see?
So my question has to do with the reach or the breadth of your account. So I understand you as claiming that justice is relational, right? That's what justice is. And there's a certain appeal to the way in which you present that idea, in which you say, well, it's not confined to a specific set of institutions, specific set of entitlements, right? Which allows us to speak of justice in more fluid context, right? I presume you'd be okay with talk of, for example, global justice or even just war, right? Because it's not just the state a la Kant or a la Rawls kind of story. So the question that then props up, that causes me to have, is the following: why? And you may not do this in the rest of your work, but why cabin your account to peace building? Right at the beginning, you tell us, well, we can't talk about peacemaking without talking about peace building. But then, why couldn't we extend that further and say, well, you know, that account of justice also has something to say to the role of soldiers in war, right?
Yeah.
So you have currently in the debates on just war theory those who say, well, we really ought to focus on at bellum, in bello, and then post bello.
Right.
And the in bello people are either individualists, right?
Right.
So the McMahon kind of people, or collectivists, the Walzer
Right.
kind of people who say
Yeah.
we just ought to care about state.
Yeah.
Do you think that your account has something to say about that too?
Yeah.
Right? About the way wars ought to be fought. So also about the in bello.
Yeah.
Right?
I do,
Okay.
actually. So why peacebuilding is because this is in reaction to a particular, the way in which it's a great question, actually, the way in which we've carved this out for particular attention and dysfunctional attention in some sense that's made most obvious where this conceptual gap, I think, this inattention to, it's not just a conceptual gap, it's an inattention to the importance and significance of conceptualizing these issues has become so obvious. But I think the implications would absolutely be to say a great deal of what is possible after war has to do with what is happening in war, and a great deal to do with the reasons for getting into war.
Right.
And so,
Because it's hard to think of dialogue or non-adversarial processes
in war, right.
But in terms of how you
Right.
think of yourself carrying the war and
Right.
what the implications
Right.
of that might be, that might, in a way, cabin the role, right? If,
Right.
if certain kinds of behavior are going to forestall certain kinds of relationship down the road, then that might
That's
have
right.
something to do about the permissibility.
That's right, and that's absolutely right. And I think it might shape our norms for assessing then either what's just war, what's just within war. You know, I don't have an image of, although it's kind of fun to imagine, maybe it's the Christmas Day story, right? But I don't have that image in mind about like suddenly then war would break out and, you know, soldiers would sit in circles and talk instead of, you know, I have very little sense of, I have an occupational hazard that people think I'm sort of soft and touchy in that kind of rearrange the furniture sort of way. I do like occasionally to watch the furniture rearranged, but I think that's because it is disruptive of our expectations of what will happen in that space, or of how it is that we can hide and structure conversation, but not because there's any magic in the reorientation. Similarly, if you looked at what happens within war, I don't think that would be represented at a level of, oh, well, then we would have to, you know, sort of fight differently or with different kinds of bullets. But what it would do is disrupt, I think, some of our assumptions or some of what we find acceptable or defensible in the name of justice in war, if we had to be very conscious of the reasons that war are fought, which for me is another relational analysis, which if you're fighting wars, presumably it is for some end state that both sides would articulate as some version of peace or end. That's got to then have some reflexive, not about their particular ends, but about the significance and importance for how this ends and can end, and what is required within war. So around what tactics you can take, what will be justified. I always hearken back to so when I worked at the TRC in South Africa, and when the report was released, everybody was mad. Like, which, you know, on some level has to be a sign that you've done your job well. At least that was the comfort of the folks who worked inside the commission. So they got sued by everybody. The ANC sued them, the National Party sued them, everybody sued them, right? Now, in part, this was a mistake because what they had done was walked over and handed the chapters that referred to each of them in advance, but had not handed them any of the conceptual chapters that described any of the difference between just war, justice in war, how they were thinking about. So they did say, like, you know, we find all of you did bad things, right? Like, that was unjust and that wasn't good. And, you know, if you really want us to tell you the truth about what's happened and its implications from the perspective of reconciliation and a just future, we all need to own these things. But we recognize there were contexts and causes and decisions, and all of that was missing. All of that was stripped away from what was handed over to them. And so they reacted to being seen on even footing, and on some very practical level, I think, see, that's why the theory part was important. Like, now look how many lawyers you just made rich. And it had real practical implications because it undermined the commitment on both sides to see the reparation recommendations of that report through. I think they are living with not bringing the level of that complexity to the engagement of the parties in terms of being able to think relationally about the impact of what they did and how that was connected to where they need to go next. They sort of took that away from them and went back to this very strict, like, we find you under the law to have done this, you should never that, you shouldn't.
So my question is about the adversarial and non-adversarial past, looking to the past, looking to the future idea. And you said that things like trials, where you find you look at what the perpetrators did, and then you dish out a punishment, and then justice is restored because they have been harmed as much as the victims. That's past looking quite obvious, and it's also adversarial quite obviously. And what you want is an approach that does the opposite, that tries to restore the relationships that have been disrupted by the harms done, and look to the future so that that perpetrators don't understand. Maybe I don't understand this right, but that perpetrators understand why these were harms, and then don't do them again because they don't want to do them again.
Right.
Something like this. And then, so then I thought about something that I can imagine, which is this dentist thing.
Yep.
And I can imagine that some of the perpetrators feel like they don't want to talk about this, or they don't want to reflect on this. This
Right.
is not, they are not willing to think about whether or not it's just that they are considered perpetrators and so far. And then I imagine that if you're in a unstable, just after a war situation, these kinds of psychological effects are going to be much enhanced, right? You don't want to suddenly have to turn around and look at yourself as someone who has done considerable wrong.
Right.
And you also don't want to be the victim who says, I'm willing to now not demand justice in form of huge punishments, instead work with the perpetrators so that they... So it seems like this kind of approach has many more things that have to be there before it can start working. It seems rather easy to go in as a powerful third party and force everyone into a trial and then dish out punishments.
Yes, it's much easier.
It's like
it's expensive, but it's very easy.
Right, and it's also, when I think about it, it seems less expensive. You don't need as many people. Once you hit them over the head, you can go away.
Right.
These kinds of things. So are there like practical ideas about how this can be done and how this can be approached once you have this situation where basically everyone's still angry from the blow up that just happened?
Right. So there's a lot of good stuff in that question. So I think absolutely it is easier to have a command and control structure where you can come in and do not require the participation or engagement of those who, so they can passively endure justice processes and suffer punishment. We do this in our domestic criminal justice system too, right? That's why the sort of joke is that almost everybody in jail is innocent, right? Because they never had to not be in order to endure the entire process. In fact, often they never had to speak. They were spoken for, they were advocated for, they won or they lost, or some kind of outcome in between, and now they just have to take their punishment and endure it, right? I've always, Jenny Nadelsky, who is a professor of mine at U of T at one point, I was working on restorative stuff while I was a student there, and she at one point decided she'd go home and try it with her kids. So they did something wrong, and she said, okay. She was trying to like follow this. And she said one of them immediately thought he could scam the system. So he was all in for the discussion. He was like, okay. But then it kind of, he was shocked by the extent of the conversation and what the outcomes were. But the other one was just clear. I am not doing that. I will go to my room. Just send me to my room, take away my whatever, and this will be over and done. I am not sitting here talking about it and figuring out how to fix it and making promises to fix it and following through. Like, that is a lot of work. And this amuses me every time I think, because now I have kids who really, those poor children, imagine what it would be like to me as a mom, really. Those poor kids. They're like, I know, I'll sit, I'll talk. I was always that patient. So I think that that's fair in terms of what's easier and what's hard for us to imagine. I mean, the other thing that becomes difficult in terms of this sort of approach is that we have very set systems that we are heavily invested in, that we have a sense of legitimacy and security in, that even if, actually the empirical evidence keeps spitting back to us, it doesn't work particularly well. It's what we've got. It works somewhat well, and it works for one really important factor that's at the core of your question, which is it works at the baseline when nothing else will. And it works for one thing, which is social protection. It can isolate and remove people from continuing to be able to perpetrate harm. And the sad thing is that's sort of the best of what it does. And then it does that in circumstances where, because that's what it does, the system does, when that's not what we need, when we actually aren't at continuing threat. But that's the tool. It's, you know, you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. This is what it does. We still need to be able to take seriously, I think, if we were to, within the system of thinking relationally about justice, not outside it, not it works for these cases and then. If you think relationally about the imperatives connected to justice, you have to think about the consequences where someone is not willing or not able to participate in the sorts of relationships in which people can be well or safe, let alone flourish, right? If people won't or can't, like the small portion that has none of the, you know, the sociopath example, which is people's favorite, or just aren't willing yet or ready or have the capacity to do that. A relational account of justice wouldn't say, well, then you don't do anything with them. A relational approach to justice says they are then continuing to perpetuate a relationship of inequality, of risk, of lack of safety. So, you know, think about the dental students. So the 13 are unwilling to participate in this restorative process, let's imagine, however many there are. The answer can't be, well, that's what we're doing, and so, you know, you don't have to do anything. We have to have a way to say, well, then that is even more proof in terms of your unwillingness to confront and talk about and come to understand the nature of these harms and to develop as professionals going out in the world a sense of why this is so harmful and why women feel so terribly at risk in terms of the structure of society and the power you hold. You're unwilling to talk about that, to hear about that, and to play an active role in figuring out how you address that and make efforts to equip yourself with the knowledge that would be required of such a professional. Well, then you are not safe. You will continue to act by virtue of your inability to respond to the harms you've caused in ways that are harmful. Social protection and protection of those relationships requires then that we take steps to protect further harm in those relationships. So I think absolutely you don't get completely away from the need for any kind of a process through which you can protect people by isolating them. What I do think then you would have to do, though, is carry through the logic of a relational approach and think about what sort of isolation from harm is necessary. What do we actually need to accomplish that and to create the capacity for people when they're ready or able to participate, to re-enter society in a way? Because right now, you know, our system doesn't do that. In fact, many would say the experience of how we incapacitate people, whether that's alienating them as pariahs within the community or labeling them or within prison, pulls people further away from having the capacity to participate in those relationships. And then they just get released and we don't understand why things, you know, aren't getting better. I think maybe the last thing to say that's related to that is the sets of, this is fundamentally a challenge of having people think differently around their expectations of justice as well. Because absolutely lots of the ways in which we bring to our justice questions, when something bad happens, we turn immediately to all the legitimate instincts that have been structured by our experience with justice systems, with how justice is served up, with how, and we would be naive to think that there is no significant process of inviting ourselves into questions to interrogate those assumptions and how deeply they operate, particularly when we are most threatened. When we're threatened, we fall back on all of the things that we feel protect us. There's no room for, well, is that really a rational choice? Or is that really, like, what does the evidence say about whether that process is going to work? This is why there's so much powerful drama around justice, language around justice. Like, it is an effective that, you know, serves us well that way, right? It is our expression of moral demand and outrage. And so we do come into those processes expecting, when we're hurt, for something bad to happen to the other person, because that's what the justice system doles out. And we will measure how much we are valued and how much we are satisfied by how much of that thing on offer gets done to the other person. Because we have had no space to really ask about what our needs and requirements are. And then we wonder why we keep churning out data from our criminal justice processes and our court systems more broadly that dictate how unsatisfied people are with that after they got exactly what they wanted, after they got the best of what the system had on offer. And I think we have to ask those questions, and I think we have to ask them not when things are just really bad, not when the entire world is yelling about Facebook and dentistry. I mean, we need those questions about justice to endure when we have time to encounter them. Some of the stuff around peace building is actually interesting because lots of the societies affected, and I don't mean to romanticize traditional justice processes, but I mean there is a sense in which, in many of those, and what we're seeing is a resonance, an opening of a space when you talk about peace building and justice in more relational ways, for them to be able to identify where some of the traditions and long-standing commitments, instincts around justice have been present in those communities, and to begin to re-examine those in terms of where do you look even to help people have a different picture, a different instinct around justice, well, often people don't have to look very far, right? To see where this is not a completely foreign and brand new idea. And I don't think we should then just like up and replicate traditional justice processes that had a whole bunch else going on that was structuring them. But in terms of our ideas and our concepts of who we are, what we need from one another, how problems get solved, it's not so alien, right? It's not so different for us and for societies engaged in the peace building process to find places where they could articulate a different story about what's required. But I think we need to do that work, and it is significant work, right? And we can't be naive in the meantime that we just do nothing to keep each other safe.
I had a question first here on structure, and then Christina. Okay. Sorry. There's you're second in the queue that I've now gotten. And
Christina.
yes.
So I'm really interested by the way that you're discussing peace building on the international scene or in the sort of war scene, and contrasting that with the sorts of things that need to be done domestically. But it leaves me with a sort of discomfort when I think about, it's not an area I've read a lot about, but my understanding is that with regards to things like Good Friday Accords and Oslo Accords and all of this, there's a lot of writing about the concept of ripeness, about whether a conflict is ripe to be solved. And there's a comfort internationally with this idea that this isn't the moment to address this, it's not ripe for solution yet, so we'll keep shooting at each other. And our domestic conflicts, I think, that starts to sound a lot like the slow walking of civil progress sometimes, the way that when equality-seeking groups say we need progress here, and the power structures say, well, we gotta take this step by step, and they slow walk the move towards racial equality or towards gender equality or towards whatever. And I guess what I wonder about is, if we're talking about relationships, is there a concept of ripeness for resolution? Is that built in when we start thinking about that? Like, if we're trying to be realistic?
Right. So your view is, which I like, so I hope this is actually what you just said to me. So this idea of ripeness exercises the same kind of effect as this notion of like slow progress, right? Like have to be ready for it within institutions, or, because in fact in our domestic context, right, that's what institutional arrangements do, right? They provide us in some ways really much needed stability and security and change, but they do that by resisting change, whole-scale change, or slowing it down, or making sure that, I mean, institutions are inherently conservative, preserving and conserving of institutional structures, because that's how they keep stability, right? And so we don't want to lose that entirely. We don't want to be naive about why that's important, but by the same token, that means that they are actually replicating sort of assumptions and ways of thinking in ways that make it harder to make reforms. And so part of the work, I think, even outside the context of immediate conflicts in domestic contexts, I have a broader scope for what I kind of put under this umbrella of what's worth paying attention to in terms of sort of more broadly, how do we have peaceful societies, is not just how do we respond when we have conflict, but how do we build the kinds of relationships within institutions that they are not replicating and reaffirming injustices, systemic discrimination, lack of access, particular hierarchies and privileges. So, but I think you're right that actually on both fronts, and you could call it realism or you could have less neutral, maybe, a less neutral sense of what's operative in terms of that, well, just wait for it to be ripe or wait for the conditions to be right. What's really fascinating about that is if you do an analysis of the sorts of conditions and the stories people tell about how situations became ripe, when they were ripe, they are almost across, without exception of the ones I know, stories about personalities and relationships and connections, or large scale, like some sort of upheaval, sometimes environmental, that changed the context and the circumstance under which people had to relate. Aceh is a great example of like what happened in terms of turning the conflict and making it ripe, that had to do with, a large tsunami. What I find, interesting is that when you ask the question that way, though, you suddenly start to say, well, if that's what makes them ripe, why do we imagine it is okay to sit back, and maybe this goes to your question about what happens in war, to sit back and to not be demanding or structuring the conditions under which we are more likely to be developing ripeness for an end of conflict or negotiation in terms of what we know about how people relate and how people come to know one another and how people interact, then are making it less likely, making the fact that most of these ripeness stories have a kind of a miracle edge to them, like suddenly we had like a Mandela or that leaves us all feeling like all we can do is wait for like the next miracle to happen, or person who is this audacious figure who thought differently from all of the prevailing contexts. And I think we need to learn much more backward from what is the ripeness of that, and what sorts of things, barring causing a natural disaster, could we be doing that create more opportunities. And so you could, let's think about Nelson Mandela, right? It wasn't until there were particular people in position of responsibility within the prison who had a particular way of dealing with Mandela and the others, that there was movement in terms of the seeds of what made that ripe, the seeds of that connection, the seeds of that building of understanding and capacity to have conversation. What would it look like if you intentionally, if you're trying to figure out how to move that, supervised or structured rules around how prisoners of war or how the Red Cross intervenes and what they demand of prisons. Like, you could imagine backing yourself up. The same is true in the domestic context. When we know what leads to institutional reform, and we know what sorts of capacities for creativity lead to that or thwart that, in terms of being able to question the system and examine the system. Part of that is about integration across systems, how governance happens, how questions are capable of being asked across institutions, across the logic of institutions. We could foster the conditions under which we'd be more likely to see that kind of ripeness emerge, I think.
Maybe just for
Sure.
Professor Llewellyn's benefit, my benefit, maybe just for conversation, just to state your names, just so we can put some names to faces as well. So I apologize for not thinking of that earlier. So you're next.
Jerry Sadoway. Yes, I was wondering if, it sounds very much like a restorative justice program to have what's sometimes done in domestic violence situations, where you have a criminal prosecution, but as part of the resolution, instead of punishment, you have training in the effects of domestic violence, and that the person who is the perpetrator has to actually engage in that as a part of their resolving their problem. And it seems to me in some ways is sort of comparable to warring countries where in fact you want to have peace. Right. Both sides want to have peace and want to be able to live together, maybe.
or the majority of the population does. And
They would at least like to stop killing one another.
yeah, right, and hurting each other, and you have imbalances of power and so on. So it's somewhat different than the idea of straight criminality, attacking to steal from somebody or whatever, where it could also be, there could be a restorative justice procedure that develops there that might be more effective than just putting the thief in jail or
Right.
making them pay a fine or pay back what they stole. So I'm just wondering about.
So there certainly are, there are lots of programs that address this sort of, and I don't mean that theft is sort of unimportant, but we often think of those as lower level in terms of the nature of the harm, in part because of the nature of the damages that are typically done, not always. There can be, extreme harms in terms of effects of people's safety, or depends on what was stolen, or the reasons and the incentives for it being stolen. I think those can be more complex, but there's lots of restorative justice programs that do that. What's really interesting about your instincts is they're borne out by the research, which is there's a sort of a meta study. So the research on restorative justice is developing and in its infancy. Part of the problem is the way in which lots of these programs are funded is they're funded as project-based, one-off funding and pilots, which is really hard to have longitudinal studies. It's an area about which the ethics of random assignment for what happens to your life, like will you go to jail or will you, is difficult. So there's only been about 1 or 2 kind of random samples. And it's also fascinating, much of the research has been driven by the sort of liberal frame of commodification in terms of program evaluation, right? So you evaluate what the funders wanted you to do, whether or not that's actually coherent with the terms of what you were trying to do. So there's lots of limits in terms of the knowledge. But there has been also an immense amount of attention in a short period of time, and across multiple jurisdictions and locations and across multiple different applications, that gives us a body of evidence that allows us to at least be able to see some, with confidence, some trends that otherwise are not explicable just by happenstance. And so, I wouldn't want to overstate the evidence that there is, but there's a good meta study of all the sort of small studies, the definition of a meta study, that looks at where restorative processes tend to work best within the scale of restorative processes. And the outcome is kind of counterintuitive to those who think this is soft and little and for low-end stuff, not remotely counterintuitive for a relational theorist, which is that they tend to work best in terms of being most robust and the parties most satisfied and most connected to the processes and the outcomes being most meaningful in contexts where there's interpersonal harm. And that's because it's easier to understand and to develop an understanding that creates the foundation for the change that needs to happen and what people need to do around the nature of the harms and the impacts, when you're not trying to understand the harms to a capitalist system that creates an economy that's run by a bunch of insurance people and people who have things, and where the notion of why you have stuff and I have stuff may be deeply connected. There's lots of harms there. It's just a lot harder to get to them because lots of them are systemic and macro, I think, and we don't spend the effort in small-based youth restorative justice programs to be thinking about the evils or otherwise of capitalism or whatever that analysis of systemic economic injustice would be. That's not really on the table there, but we do, in cases of interpersonal harm, demand of one another some explanation of why is there this pattern? Why do you hurt me? Why are our gender relationships structured this way in the example that you gave? And we do that more or less well, depending on the program and how it's resourced. The other really interesting part of your question is that you're right in that one of the things that restorative justice processes tend to do in terms of how you would describe the nature of the work is they tend to be more educative within the process themselves. So where we see human rights is a great example, where we've started to see the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission has revamped most of their processes to be restorative and based on a kind of a more relational theory of rights. But when we see the way they used to work is the way that lots of our processes work. We'll figure out what everybody did and what needs to happen, and then we'll tell them what they need to do by way of education or by way of changing or rehabilitation in jail or whatever that sort of account is of change, that sort of theory of change. Restorative processes take that, I think, theory of change in terms of the significance of understanding and education to meet need, like to be central to knowing what needs need to be met and central to making a difference in the future within the process itself. They're more dependent and reliant on those than harm or command and control or other sorts of processes. And so what we've seen in human rights is those processes, instead of now ordering human rights education or sensitivity training or that work is being done within the process and in preparation for the process. And so the outcomes tend to not be ordered to do all of these things. It's also interesting that they have much higher compliance rates. So lots of the people ordered to do many of those things following the traditional justice processes don't, because it's very hard to order them to do many of those things. Whereas when you're choosing to do that because it's been part of a learning process and you have responsibility you're exercising to carry forward, it's not surprising we see compliance rates in the 80 to 90%.
Next in the queue is Christina.
Oh, sorry.
I think it was a sweater day. It was a sweater day.
Inside joke.
Christina Candea. So earlier today in my ethical lawyering class, we actually had a really great speaker, Jeffrey Hewitt, who was talking about integrating the Indigenous law system into Canadian law. Yeah, which was great, and it was a great preamble to all of this. So my question has to do with culture. How much does culture predetermine the way we deal with relationships and cope with broken relationships? Yeah. And I mean, we are in an individualistic centered society where individual rights and like it's very like individual centered in every way in terms of rights and defenses and everything. So how can we have equality relationships in the way you define it when we focus so much on individual values as opposed to collective values? And I guess that's where I would fall on the spectrum Professor Francois was talking about earlier. So yeah, my question is, can we have equality relationships when our values are so entrenched in individual-centered views? How can we change those views otherwise? Do we start with like from schooling or kind of where I'm going with that?
Yeah. So it's a great connection to recognize the resonance in terms of both the traditions out of which relational theory notions of thinking about human beings and the world relationally arise. I think that, often people will say, oh, well, restorative justice is just misappropriating or appropriating practices from other contexts. But I think certainly sometimes that's true. And where we do that in unthinking ways at a practice level, I think we really need to be very careful and very wary. And so I'm quite critical of that. I think that if we want to think about how you might practice or express restorative justice, this is why it's imperative that you be rooting it somewhere in a conceptual base that says, well, look, this is about a relational theory, because in fact, there is a resonance and a learning and a collaborative exchange or conversation that can be had to see where the roots of knowledge and wisdom rest about what, not only what a relational account is, but what its implications might be. And so there, I think you can give an account of when we start to try to think relationally, it is not surprising that we would look to for guidance or wisdom or potential applicable processes to other cultures and contexts and traditions. In our context, Aboriginal law and life ways where they have been better able to maintain and live by, not completely, but maintain and live by and articulate a more relational worldview, and to then try to develop and push back upon activities and processes that are inconsistent with that worldview. And so there should be that then space, I think, of learning what could this mean, without assuming that what you do is import all of that culture through that way of living, and we just try to pretend that we work that way and have. So I think that's very insightful. I think it's not only true of of Aboriginal law and lifeways here, I think, you'll see that replicated in lots of faith traditions and cultures and spiritual practices around the world, and it's been a very important, and I think, aside from some over-romanticization of it or sort of like weak kind of nods to it, not properly excavated in terms of the kind of wisdom and knowledge and the challenge that would pose. So I think it's a really open space for more research and more learning. Well, I don't know, like part of me wants to be a bit like, I don't know, I don't want to be flippant, but it would be a flippant answer to say, sure, that's what the revolution's about. Yep, we live like that every day, and then maybe we should do something about that. But the less flippant answer is, I actually am not sure that's true of who we think we are. I think when we actually articulate who we think we are, we would each tell a story that's actually quite deeply relational. I think that's why actually what I say or what I do or what I think in terms of relational theory is not particularly startling or new or like I'm not saying anything that would get me a PhD in philosophy probably. Maybe it would, who knows. Have to write it up really well. But I think on some level you don't need me to come here and tell you think you're relational. If I ask you, when you make difficult choices, this is sort of some of Jenny Nadelsky's work, right? If I ask you when you make difficult choices and judgments, what happens in that process and where do you go and how do you move from what I think I want to do to making a good and informed judgment? Who do you call upon? What's important in terms of the richness of what informs those decisions and helps you? When you woke up this morning, it's more than just a fact about how you live that somebody may have kept you up snoring or that you checked your email 33 times on the way here because you were waiting for news, or that you sat next to someone who was sitting way too close to you on the subway. I mean, I think we think of other ways in which you got here this morning and thought about the range of obligations that are central to who you are and what choices you make. I think actually we do give accounts of our identity, of our choice making, of our thinking that reflect for us that at some level, of course we're related, of course this is true of who we are. I think we do not structure and live our lives as if this were true all the time. And we seem to accept the inevitability of institutions that are based on that fact not really mattering or factoring in. And I think that, yes, that is what makes it so difficult to imagine that we could achieve this kind of equality or to do more robust justice. I think that is why many of our social systems repeatedly fail us. What amazes me is why we are so shocked and surprised that these systems that fail to take account of who we are and what we need from one another and can't see us as holistic beings but carve us up into governmental silos, why we are then so shocked that they fail with such regularity, that they cannot meet our needs because they are not taking our needs into account. And I do think that maybe it's time that we start to ask really hard questions about what set of assumptions are driving those institutions that might not be fitting with who we are and what we know we need. And so, then back to my flippant answer, I think that is part of the challenge. I think that is what we're seeing in the newspapers in terms of the depth of the debate, the sort of visceralness of the debate about what justice requires. In terms of our fear of how it constantly fails us and what we want to happen. But we haven't been able to question, there has been no emperor has no clothes moment about the system we so admire and rely on.
I'm Eva Marszewski, and I started an organization called Peacebuilders about 10 years ago. My background is law and litigation and related things. But Peacebuilders started with the whole idea that restorative justice approach can make changes in the youth justice system. And so I just wanted to comment. I mean, it's always fascinating for me to hear you, Jennifer, because your level of understanding and breadth of understanding is always very helpful to fit in a lot of the things that we see on the ground. I consider myself a practitioner in restorative justice. And someone raised the question, or I think a couple of people raised the whole question, as to how decisions are made and who is involved in making those decisions. And we've now worked with, I don't know, over 500 or more youth over a period of time, diverting them out of the justice system, each one of them, with various levels of seriousness in those offenses that were involved. Every single one of those cases, the young person was directly involved with the other stakeholders in determining how their behavior should be dealt with. So they weren't just basically, okay, let's find out what you did, and now we're going to decide what we're going to do with you. What do you think you should do with yourself? How can we help you take account and take responsibility and do something about the harms that have been caused? So that's the one thing that I wanted to say that is very different.
Eva does not escape being engaged in the dentistry because she has an article in the Globe and Mail this morning about it.
Thank you. And so that's one thing that's distinctly different from every other process I've been involved in. And I've been both in the courts and arbitration processes, and even in mediations. A lot of mediations are really an opportunity for the mediator to facilitate the resolution the mediator thinks ought to be the end of the story. But the other thing is your question about diversity. I think fundamentally, and Jennifer, when you talk about it at the level of theory, and we're talking about relational issues, at the ground floor level, it's about caring. And as soon as someone sees that you genuinely care about them, and whether it's electromagnetic waves that radiate out because you seem to care, or your body language, or whatever it is, as soon as people recognize that you really care about what you're talking about and the person you're dealing with, they will respond. And I can tell you from my personal experience, it doesn't matter whether I'm green, black, white, red, or polka dots. It doesn't matter whether I'm old or young, male or female. When people genuinely see you care, they will respond. And that's an easy statement to make. It's not easy to unpackage that, because how people perceive whether you actually do or don't care, there's so many layers and layers of that onion skin that needs to be unpeeled before people can actually trust themselves that they really fully understand and think or imagine that you care, because most people will distrust themselves in that impression. Anyways, so there's an awful lot of very important work that needs to be done in this field, and it needs to be done at all these different levels. And I think that it would be a fabulous opportunity to take one of those big, huge wall charts, Jennifer, and take some of your concepts and then put them up there, and then start doing pictures and connections so that we can actually see how all these pieces fit.
Yeah, and it's great to me. I mean, so one of the connections to make is to say, you know, at the micro level where I think we can imagine these processes happening, and it becomes harder for people to imagine as you scale up. But what's really interesting is that, let's take the example you give of one of the things that a restorative process makes possible that we otherwise find more difficult is the active taking of responsibility and participatory nature of the processes on the part of the party that's done harm. Well, if you think about what's necessary post-war conflict, and you're trying to imagine how is it going to be possible for these people to build some sort of a peaceful society where this is what they've been doing with one another, and this is how they've been treating one another, and we're just suddenly going to say, well, the war's over now, like, we'll put peacekeepers in to make sure that you behave, like, we'll supervise you, and the deal is you will behave so long as we're there supervising you. And then when we leave, we know what happens. You know, the UN stat is 5 years later, 50% of these contexts are back into violence. Well, 5 years is about the expiry date of peacekeepers. So we really need to take seriously at this level, not just at a conceptual level, but at a very practical level, at post-conflict. How is it that the processes we utilize in order to make peace and build peace create the capacity and the actual experience of living in those ways together, like of figuring out how do you take responsibility, how do you continue to have difficult conversations, And the link to the sustainability of that is we also see the setup of institutions where the seeds of those conflicts reemerge but are ignored because so in the justice system, because we treat those reemergence and resurgence of conflict as if they are individual wrongdoing, and the system cannot and does not look for the deeper connection to social disruption until it's too late. And so we need to be able to see those processes that can accommodate not just individual culpability, but its connection to social causes and contexts, because the stakes are so high. That's where the stakes are in terms of reemergence of violence. And the other interesting thing I'd say about, I take your point, that's true, that's very true about the capacity and significance of how is it that we can communicate across culture. So I don't think it's the case that you can only run sort of restorative-like processes in homogeneous communities where you already have the capacity to know and understand one another. In fact, I think the peace-building context shows us that this is a really important place where we can have processes that, unlike mediation or only negotiation, that are aimed at agreement at the other end, that we can sort of do a Habermas thing where we actually think what matters here is we may not agree, but we have to come to some understanding of one another, because it's that fundamental misunderstanding that leads to catastrophic social conflict. So I think we can do that across cultural bounds. I do think that, and it is because of the legitimacy and the connection to, at a micro level, I care, like I have concern for you, I respect your dignity as a person, and we can come to that understanding. But I think the other really important thing about restorative processes is that they are not a universal model. In fact, one of the things that should recommend them to us is that at the level of the structure of those processes, they precisely ask questions about what is the context here by way that people might be able to encounter one another, have conversation, come to understanding, and that those, not all of the culture just has to be accepted wholesale, but you have to be realistic about the context in which you're in, and you have to be able to not see this as an imperialistic goal to have everybody think the same way and operate the same way. And we've seen real harms that way, right? Well-intentioned people going in and saying, I have a universalistic model of restorative justice. It has question cards and posters, and I'll go to, my favorite was this American organization showing up in Jamaica where I'd been doing quite a bit of work, where I had steadfastly refused on a regular basis to tell them how to do this. I was like, how would I know that? I do not live here. I don't live with that level of risk and danger every day. You tell me. Like, I'll ask you the questions, and they showed up and said, no, here's how you do this exactly like this. You sit in a corner, you ask these questions. We don't give any regard to who asked these questions, of whom, who looks who in the eye, who seriously almost got people killed. I'm not being dramatic. Like that you cannot just throw people in a room and say, hey, buddy, you, talk to you over here. And we don't care if you're a Don and you're not, and you're of that group, and there are no women in the room who we're all going to feel we're accountable to for our aunties. You have to know those things. And I know that's what you were saying. You have to know those things.
Yes, there's an awful lot of background. I'm sorry I'm sort of jumping in just on this one point. There is a huge amount of preparation work that is required, and there needs to be trust building. It's not just exactly what you say. It can be extremely dangerous to just, and in fact, not just in Jamaica, in Gin and Finch, to throw the wrong two groups of kids together, and who knows what could happen in that situation. So you can't just say, okay, there's a conflict and we're just going to throw people here into this room and then
which may be
do
to your
whatever,
ripeness
right?
question too, which is, I think the ripeness is a larger question around when are political conflicts ripe. I think it is also recognizing that if you go into a peace building or peacemaking context, you have to be really insightful about the sort of pre-work, right? So that this doesn't, we immediately want to go to models, and one of the models we have is throw everybody in a room and talk to one another, rather than building capacity for that dialogue and that conversation that I think is about the ripeness that people would have to even have a chance of understanding one another. Like you have to be very, very wary, I think, in terms of the way in which these ideas come off the page, sometimes with a certain amount of naivete about how everybody can just get in a room and chat it out. I think it requires something much more radically invested than that.
Hi, my name is Gyuna, and I'm a PhD student. My question is a little bit different than others' questions. So It's just a conversation between me and my supervisor today morning, and I want to share it with you.
Okay.
So my question precisely about peace and justice in the Middle East, and precisely Syria. So many of al-Assad regime opponents are refraining from conducting a peace agreement because they are asking for justice and precisely for trial.
Right.
So my question for you, or just brainstorming,
Right.
do you think that trial will help, or this kind of justice will help in conducting peace agreement in Syria?
Well, I think there's a real politic answer, which is if they've decided that that's the criteria by which they'll come to the table, it might at least help get them to the table. But I think that's a pretty minimal level of like, how will it help, right? I assume you're asking me a bigger question than just like, how will they show up at the negotiations? I think it's a complicated question. It's not an unfamiliar dilemma, right? Which is no peace till there's justice, no justice till there's peace. Like what I will say is we often rely on trials as if that will do the justice work that will be required for people once they do get to the peace negotiations to be able to do anything constructive. And it very seldom does, and sometimes makes things worse. The caveat to that is it depends on why they're asking for this. So if it is the case that their concern is that these people continue to not have, that there's been no recognition of responsibility by them, that there's been no divestment of power and control or of influence in such a way that the peace negotiations would be unsafe, that the capacity to have honest peace negotiations is impossible because there's been no denunciation or no capacity to remove the ongoing exercise of power and influence by those who will continue to cause violence or harm or intimidate at the peace table. Then you do have a dilemma, right? You can't move into the sort of more robust processes that depend on people being in having at least the baseline capacity for these sort of relational conversations and coming to understanding. So there is and I say that, but I think we overuse that. So we don't then ask that question and actually sort out the answer to it. Who is there that are the bad actors who are going to continue in the background or in the foreground to exercise manipulation and influence and thwart the peace accords or get what they want or use intimidation, and who amongst them isn't? What we do is we then say, okay, well, trials stand in for justice, so we'll go from the top to the bottom, which usually ends up being from the bottom to the top because that's where we have the evidence, right? And we'll get as high up as we can in the bad guys, and then we'll say, well, we've satisfied that, or at least to the level that we can. We often do a disservice to justice because we can't get at the people in terms of evidence who've done the worst things. So that makes us then cynical about this. But maybe we'll have created the conditions under which we've silenced them or outed them enough that we could move on with peace negotiations. Sometimes when we do that in really unthinking ways, where we actually don't need it for the sake of social protection, where we actually don't need it because we don't inquire who might be catalysts and willing to participate in a different way or have the capacity to participate in a different way, we absent some of the most important catalysts for lasting change and genuine negotiation and change because they do continue to hold power. Trials don't do a particularly good job of changing minds in the context of long-standing cyclical social conflicts. They become martyrs, right? They don't, not very often do they have the effect we hope. And they're expensive. So we also tend to pick, a la Sierra Leone, who we will invest in prosecuting, who will satisfy our need for justice the greatest because they seem the baddest guys. And we forget that for the victims on the ground and the people who, the worst guy is the guy or gal is the one who did something to me. And I become devalued and I become less important, or what happened to me is less significant in the story of what justice requires because you only went after these bad guys. So my harm that needs to be addressed in a just way goes unaddressed. And then we kind of hope that these half-funded, underutilized truth commissions will give them an outlet and make them feel better. I think we need to do much better than that if we're really asking robustly about what would be required, not just to get to the table for peace negotiations, but to build a peace that is likely to be lasting and sustainable. And it requires us to not be naive about who may not be able to do that or who may thwart that, but also not to be careless in our, is careless the word I want? Yeah, not as careful as we should be in terms of asking really hard questions that may mean engaging with and involving and working with, in a more restorative response to justice, those who are willing to do that. And, you know, I think we make assumptions all the time that are not helpful to us in terms of who the catalysts and agents for peace actually could be, to our detriment.
Maybe just one question that I was thinking about in terms of conceptual shifts. I thought, I mean, that's a fascinating part of the work that has to be done. I think you could be quite pleased that that part of the argument is successful. Right? There's not much pushback, and I don't think there ought to be. I think you're persuasive on making a case for the conceptual shift between
Could you tell the news media?
Yeah, if I could have some access to it.
That would be lovely.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, just in terms of an adversarial individualist conceptual framework being replaced, or at least balanced, at least with a restorative or relational approach. But in terms of a conceptual improvement, I'm curious about whether you think that restorative justice itself is a bit of a misleading label or expression for the kinds of ideas.
Yep.
At least, I mean, for restorative, you assume that if something's going to be restored, there had to be
yeah.
a point when it was whole at first.
Yep.
And many contexts in which there's conflict
Yep, there's not.
are contexts in which the conflicts have been going on for decades, years, decades, centuries, longer. And so I'm just wondering if there's a worry there about restorative giving us the wrong impression that you are trying to restore relationships rather than forge or form new ones. And I guess I hadn't thought about this, but in the context of youth correctional justice or alternatives to youth correctional justice, often those who are facilitating and prepping, trying to develop relationships of trust are not the ones who were originally involved, originally harmed.
Absolutely.
Like new relationships are formed. So how easy does a term sort of sit?
It doesn't, I mean, the fact that I talk about it absolutely every single time I talk about restorative justice is a significant cue that it doesn't sit particularly well. So what I'm about to say, I say not actually by defense of the term, and you'll notice that I inelegantly sometimes switch between relational justice and restorative justice. And I do that because for me it is a relational theory of justice, and there was an existing body and movement of restorative justice. And my claim is that to make sense of what that is on the ground in practice and in terms of the conceptual shift that was driving us to develop it, I think that is relational theory. So I'd say sort of two things. If I ran the world and had thought that it would not have caused more conceptual and practical difficulty and dissension, I probably would just call it relational justice, because I think that's what it is, a relational conception of justice. And we've seen moves like that before. So, for example, there's a group that similarly, because they didn't want, like restorative, started calling it transformational justice. And so this then became a turf battle because if you're going to call it something different, you want to be able to make some, more righteous argument about how it is different, instead of actually just saying, we call it that because we're really tired of explaining to people that restorative justice does not turn on the status quo ante, that it is not trying to restore things to the way they were before. What I can say to help make sense of why this started in the first place is that restorative justice emerged out of a faith tradition whereby the reference point that they came with, right, was right relationship with God. And so if your reference point is an enduring standard to which you can aspire, the restoration is to the intentions of relationship. I don't root my relational theory in that particular tradition. I can make sense of the sense in which restore is not completely a misnomer, because for me it is restoring to the conditions that I think are deeply connected to what we need to be well. So the analogy, instead of sort of restoring to the past, is what do we do when someone is born with a heart problem? So imagine a child, right? We don't actually restore it. It emerges when they're like 2 or 3. We don't restore it to the way the heart was. There was no pre-existing place of a heart to return to, but we return it to a fully functional place, to what we know the heart does within the body in terms of how it needs to function. I think that can make sense to me. So the goal is not a return to, is a restoration of the ideals of right relationship. So I can explain it. I just think it's actually not that helpful to have that kind of I don't feel that I am trapped in actually arguing for anything that is a return to a status quo ante, nor that the wording requires that to be so. I wish that it would be the case that eventually whatever words you say what you mean and mean what you say. I do take your point, and I think you're just right, that in the project of trying to make a conceptual shift and to really influence how people are thinking and constructing and framing the world, that it is particularly unhelpful to have a word that has them slip back into. It is why I don't actually think that just the burdensome things and difficult things that people experience and commit to doing through a restorative process, so we should just call punishment because people feel it's punishing. Because that also has a bunch of kind of baggage around imposed and pain for pain's sake that I think is problematic. So I don't think you're wrong. I think then I live in a world where you try to think about how the practical effect of that conceptual shift may have its greatest place, and not want to be contributing to those who are trying to make that conceptual shift without. So that's why I spend a great deal of time in my work sort of talking more about a relational theory of justice and connecting the restorative justice movement and the idea of restorative justice to that. But I think you're not wrong.
Okay, we've exhausted our time. Please join me in thanking Ms. Llewellyn for a wonderful talk and discussion.